Place names have a lot of history in them. The town that's the symbol of tourism in the Smoky Mountains, Gatlinburg, is no exception. Today we tell the fascinating story of how Gatlinburg, Tennessee got its name and the feud that caused the town's namesake to move away. Hello folks, you're listening to Stories, a History of Appalachia.
You know, Steve, what intrigues me about this story is we're going to find out the name, how it got the name, Gatlinburg. But I always wanted to know how Gatlinburg popped up in the song A Boy Named Sue with Johnny Cash, because he, of course, tracks him there, and then they erupt into a big bar fight there, and they go out into the streets of Gatlinburg. But I have to say this also. When I hear of Gatlinburg, I think of one particular surname, and it's been all over the place. It's been air tours, it's been water parks, different things like that. But we're about to find out it's not just one surname that's involved. There are two.
That is absolutely true. And back to your point there, I can't tell you why A Boy Named Sue referenced Gatlinburg, but I can tell you where the name Sue came from. Do you know that?
No, I don't.
Do you remember a certain lawsuit down in Dayton, Tennessee over teaching evolution?
Yeah, we're not far away from the, I guess, the anniversary of such the verdict, I guess, in that whole story?
Mm-hmm. That was today as we're recording this. Mm-hmm. Sue came from Sue Hicks, who was one of the attorneys in that case.
Ah, I did not know that. Wow.
But aside from that, let's get back to Gatlinburg, okay? What would become the town of Gatlinburg was first settled in 1802 when a man from South Carolina named William Ogle, and that's, I'm sure, the name you're thinking of, Rod,
right,
came and started a homestead, intent on bringing his wife and children to the mountains once he got everything ready for them. That, sadly, was not to be. Mr. Ogle died before he could fetch his family, but that did not deter Mrs. Ogle, though, did it, Rod?
No, it didn't, Steve, because Martha Jane Ogle, her brother Peter Husky, and the Ogle children soon came to William's homestead in the place named White Oak Flats for all the white oaks there to start a new life in the Great Smoky Mountains. The Ogle family took to the land, and as the Bible says, they were fruitful, multiplied, becoming the largest family there. To this day, the name Ogle is very common in Sevier County, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. So you might be saying to yourself, why isn't Gatlinburg Ogleburg? Well, that, as someone once said, is the rest of the story, isn't it, Steve?
Yeah, it sure is. And the rest of that story happens to be a man named Radford Gatlin, who came to White Oak Flats in 1854 with his wife Elizabeth. Now, Mr. Gatlin was a well-educated man and an entrepreneur at heart. Among the many jobs he held were teacher, merchant, politician, militia captain, and a minister. Now, it's said that one doesn't get to be successful without stepping on someone else's toes, and Radford Gatlin was apparently a very successful man, at least financially. You see, before he came to Sevier County, the Gatlin family spent some time in Jefferson County, where he had moved in 1825. And over the next 13 years, he got his hands on 220 acres there in 3 tracts. 70 acres from Callaway Hodges in 1833, 55 acres from James Thornton in 1836, and a state grant of 100 acres in 1838, all in the Strawberry Plains area. Gatlin then proceeded to make enemies of his neighbors, suing them over one small thing or another in court. Now, he lost most of those lawsuits, alienating the people who lived around him. So, Rod, it's no surprise that in 1842 he sold his land and moved across the county line to Sevier County in Paw Paw Hollow, where he ran for office and won, representing the 12th District in the county court. And Rod, he also taught school there.
Well, he and his wife Elizabeth joined the local Baptist church, the Paw Paw Hollow Baptist Church, after a revival, and 1 year later he was made an assistant pastor and the church clerk, recording the events of the congregation. Soon, Radford found his calling and became a ordained Baptist minister, the full-time minister at the Paw Paw Church. Life was good for Radford Gatlin. At least it was until he started to stir up, you know what again. He found it necessary to write a letter to the Tennessee Baptist Convention about a church in Jonesboro, didn't he, Steve?
He did, and what he did was get himself into a hornet's nest.
Wow.
At that time, there was a big controversy in the Baptist church over missionary Baptist church and regular Baptist church, and whether a church ought to be a missionary church or not, and who could attend and who could be baptized, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Jonesboro church was set up as a missionary Baptist church in 1842. Gatlin's letter criticized the Tennessee Baptist Convention for a policy of allowing only missionary Baptists to be given fellowship at the church, saying that neither anti nor pro-missionary Baptists should be denied fellowship. This missionary versus anti-missionary Baptist controversy was such a big issue in the Baptist church of the day, and Gatlin stepped right into the middle of it. This concerned the Baptist Convention, so they sent a committee to the Pawpaw Church to investigate Pastor Gatlin, which, to be honest, should have been a minor bump in the road for him. Instead, when the committee arrived in Sevier County, Gatlin refused to allow them to enter the Pawpaw Church, so he was reported to the state convention as being most rude and uncivil. The committee was sent back to the church for a second investigation, and this time they weren't going to take no for an answer, and neither was Radford Gatlin. And Rod, that's where the fun started, right?
Yep, because over the half-day period, the committee members and Gatlin were at odds. A fist fight even occurred on the church grounds over Gatlin's refusal to allow the committee to enter the church. Later, apparently sensing things were not going his way, Pastor Gatlin relented a bit and told the committee that, they could use the church if they would not discuss the letter with parishioners and make up their minds about him in 10 minutes. Well, instead, the committee met with church members in a shed on the grounds, then drew up articles of complaint, and immediately kicked Radford Gatlin out of the Pawpaw Hollow Baptist Church. Time for the Gatlin family to move on, so it appears.
In 1854, Radford and Elizabeth sold their land for a profit and bought 50 acres of land in White Oak Flats from Elisha Ogle, along with a claim for 5,000 more acres from a 100,000-acre grant that Mr. Ogle had gotten from the state of Tennessee. These 5,000 acres included some land already settled, which would cause some issues between Gatlin and his neighbors. Once moved on to his new land, Radford Gatlin opened a general store and the village's first post office with Richard Reagan, the first postmaster. And on January 29, 1856, White Oak Flats was renamed Gatlinburg by the U.S. Postal Service, I'm assuming at the suggestion of Radford Gatlin.
Wow. And you mentioned another name that's been prominent down in Sevier County and Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg, and that was Reagan, which we'll talk more about here toward the end of our story. But just for you folks out there, let me just tell you, a lot of people would have shrugged off the name change. They wouldn't have thought anything about it. But that doesn't always mean things were fine and dandy in the new Gatlinburg. As always, Radford Gatlin made his own trouble. A new road was planned for the town, but Gatlin did not like how it was being laid out. So to him, it didn't pass along enough of his land for his taste. So he then filed a lawsuit in 1857 to get the roadway plans changed so it ran along his own property, and he won. The road through Gatlinburg today follows the path directed by that court ruling, by the way. Then there was the matter of the cattle, Steve, and why don't you tell them about that? This has to do with a little bit of some, abuse, maybe to some degree, of some of the cattle?
Yeah, possibly. Turns out that Elizabeth Gatlin got in the habit of hitting Thomas Ogle Sr.'s cattle with a stick if they came around her. Apparently they were bothering her, so she figured she'd take care of it herself. This, as you might imagine, concerned Mr. Ogle, so he went to speak to Mrs. Gatlin about the matter. But according to witnesses, she hit him with the same stick.
Ooh.
Words were exchanged, and soon Radford got into the fight with Thomas, too. Thomas Ogle sued the Gatlins for assaulting him and won in the Sevier County Court, which fined Radford Gatlin $1. But Mr. Gatlin would have none of that nonsense, so he appealed the case to the Tennessee Court of Appeals and lost, then on to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which upheld the original court ruling. And, Rod, we have no idea if he ever paid that $1 or not. But this whole issue then apparently blew up, didn't it?
Yes, it did. This whipping cattle and things with that stick, just wasn't the first straw. This was going to be the next one out of the whole thing. Mysteriously, the Gatlin barns and stables were burned down. They lost all their stored grains and their horses in the fire. Gatlin sued Thomas Ogle and his son Levi for arson, but no indictments were handed down. Then, just as mysteriously as someone burning down the barns and stables, someone began killing the Gatlin cattle in the woods. The law was unable to determine who was responsible, and nobody was ever indicted for those acts. But Radford Gatlin had it figured out. He knew who had done it.
On December 14th, 1857, Mr. Gatlin swore out a peace warrant against Thomas Ogle Sr., along with his sons and others, claiming they were plotting to burn down his house and then kill him and Elizabeth. The case was dismissed, and Gatlin was ordered to pay the court cost of what the court deemed a frivolous action. And again, Radford Gatlin appealed the Sevier County Court decision to the Tennessee Supreme Court, and again, the Supreme Court upheld the Sevier County Court's ruling. So with that, Radford and Elizabeth Gatlin, apparently having never been involved in a feud, figured that they had pushed things too far with the wrong people, so they left the town that bore their last name. They moved back to the relative safety of Jefferson County.
Well, by this time, Tennessee had seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy, and the Civil War had begun. Gatlin, unlike many of the other residents of East Tennessee, was a supporter of the Confederacy. He wrote letters to an Atlanta newspaper giving accounts of the war in his part of Tennessee, including one about a Confederate soldier who stopped the burning of a rail bridge across the Holston River, who also killed 3 Lincolnites, or Unionists, with a dagger while doing so. It turned out later that the incident was greatly embellished by Radford Gatlin, no doubt, with the part of the 3 Lincolnites being killed being untrue. The account was deemed to be wartime propaganda. And, you know, Steve, after federal troops occupied Jefferson County in 1863, the Gatlins then fled to Georgia, then on to South Carolina, where they spent the rest of their lives.
You know, there are probably tourists to Gatlinburg that have spent more time there than Mr. and Mrs. Gatlin, to be honest with you.
I would say so. I'd make you a good bet that that's probably the truth out of that. But, you know, the one thing that I always got a big kick out of when I first started going as probably preteen, teenager, somewhere in there, when I first went to Gatlinburg, was the first thing I could remember pulling in on the parkway and then coming down through there and seeing Reagan something. And my mom said out loud, she says, "I'll bet you that's some of Ronald Reagan's relatives that live down here." And, you know, sure enough, it wasn't long after that. I think Reagan was doing a speech somewhere in Tennessee, I think maybe in Sevier County or down there close, and he said something about he was hoping that the Reagans were kin to him. He said at least they had a good last name.
Well, that other name, Ogle, is it's widespread down there in Sevier County.
Yeah.
They have judges named Ogle, lawyers named Ogle. In fact, I worked with a fellow whose real name was Ogle in radio. He didn't go by that name.
Right.
He actually still works in radio part-time as an announcer at one of the big stations down in Knoxville. So, Dave, how you doing?
This has been, though, one of the most interesting stories because I didn't know how Gatlinburg had got its name. I have, you know, always wondered how it got its name, but, you know, I guess more than anything else, thanks to the listener out there that suggested this story because, hey, you piqued my interest on this story. And if you've got a good story that you'd like to pass along to us as a possibility for a script here being used on stories, we'd encourage you to email us and let us know about it because, hey, we enjoy this stuff. I enjoy getting these new stories in and finding out things that sometimes the newspapers and others didn't cover, or at least it was reduced to, how can I say it, back page sort of ways. It wasn't exactly on the front page news all the time with some of these stories.
And that, folks, is the fascinating story of how Gatlinburg got its name. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to the Stories Podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Audible, Odyssey, Spotify, Stitcher, Good Pods, or in your favorite podcast app. Until next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.